The Pacific does not forgive. Every sailor knows this. Every man who has ever stood watch in the dark hours before dawn, staring out at water that breathes with something ancient and indifferent, knows this truth in his bones. The ocean does not hate you. It simply does not care whether you live or die. It was here before you arrived. It will be here long after you are gone. And in the space between those two facts, you are nothing. You are foam. You are salt. You are a warm body in the process of becoming something the sea can use. So when the radio operator aboard the USS training vessel Resolute picked up a faint thermal signature on the surface scanner at 0312 hours, 40 nautical miles off the coast of San Diego, nobody expected to find a person. They expected debris. The remains of a pleasure boat, a piece of cargo lost from a container ship running the Trans-Pacific Lane 300 miles north. They expected something inert and waterlogged that would explain the heat signature and allow them to log it and move on. They did not expect a young woman. They did not expect her to be alive. And they certainly did not expect what they would discover about her once she was. She had been in the water for 72 hours, not drifting unconsciously, not clinging to wreckage with the frantic grip of a drowning person who has given up thinking and surrendered entirely to instinct. She was lying flat on her back across a section of hull plating, roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. Her left arm hung over the edge, trailing in the water. Her right hand was pressed flat against her own sternum, fingers spread as though she were checking her own heartbeat, the way a physician checks a patient's pulse, counting, measuring, managing. Her lips were cracked white with salt. Her skin was the color of old paper burned dark across the cheekbones and forehead, where 3 days of equatorial sun had worked on her without mercy. Her hair was dark brown, dried stiff with brine into tangles that spread across the hull plate like a halo. But her eyes were open, and they were moving. She was reading the stars. Petty Officer Second Class Colt Briggs was first over the side of the RHIB. He was 28 years old, built like a man who had never once stopped moving since the day he learned to walk, and he had the kind of face that said he had seen most things and found very few of them surprising. He dropped into the water beside the hull plate, got his hands under the edge, and looked up at the woman lying there. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Ma'am," Briggs said, "United States Navy, you're going to be okay." The woman blinked once. Then she said in a voice scraped clean by salt and thirst, but still composed, "Which direction is north?" Briggs stared at her. "Ma'am, north," she said again. "I need to verify my position." "Which direction?" Briggs pointed. She looked where he was pointing, looked back at the Skauenbei, made a small, almost imperceptible adjustment in her reasoning, the kind of internal calculation that shows on a person's face only if you know exactly what you are looking for. A cartographer correcting a map. A navigator reconciling dead reckoning against a fixed point. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said, "I'm ready." Briggs would tell the story later in the debrief, and he would say that those were not the words of a woman who had just survived 3 days alone on the open Pacific. They were the words of someone waiting for a scheduled pickup, like she had somewhere to be and was mildly inconvenienced by the delay. He did not know what to make of it. None of them did. Not yet. The RHIB came alongside the Resolute at 0341 hours, and Commander Reed Stroud was waiting on the deck when they brought her up. Stroud was 52 years old and looked every single one of those years without apology. Not old the way a man gets old when life has worn him down, but the way certain kinds of metal age harder, denser. Everything soft burned away until what remained could absorb almost any impact and simply hold. He had a jaw like a shelf of granite and eyes the color of deep water, the kind of gray-blue that traps light rather than reflecting it. He had commanded SEAL Team 8 for 4 years. Before that, 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan and 1 operation he still could not discuss in any official setting. He had seen medics work under fire. He had seen men survive things that should have killed them. He had learned over the course of all of it to reserve judgment. He looked at the woman they were lifting from the RHIB, and he reserved his. She was small, smaller than he had expected it from Briggs' radio report, which had somehow conveyed the impression of someone larger. No more than 5 feet 4 inches, and the weight she was carrying looked like less than 120 pounds. Her cargo pants and long-sleeved shirt were torn and salt-stained beyond recovery. The team medic, Petty Officer Daly, was already checking her pupils with a penlight. She let him do it without flinching, without the dazed cooperation of someone in shock. She held still with the patience of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and had decided to permit it. "Vitals," Stroud asked. "BP's low, sir. 88/60. Heart rate elevated 64. Core temp reading, 96.2. Dehydration is significant. Daly paused. She's fully oriented, though. That is not typical for this level of exposure. Stroud nodded slowly. He looked at the woman. She was looking back at him, not with the blank survivor's stare of someone whose mind had gone somewhere distant to protect itself, not with the trembling relief of a person pulled back from the edge of dying. She was looking at him the way a person looks at a stranger they need a quick, accurate read on. Assessing rank, assessing character, filing it away. "What's your name?" Stroud said. "Tessa Kane," she said. "Petty Officer, 2nd Class Navy Corpsman, HM2. A pause. "Sir," Stroud absorbed this. "You're a corpsman." "Yes, sir." "And your first question when my man pulled you off that piece of hull," Stroud said carefully, "was which direction was north." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, something more contained than that. "I needed to verify my dead reckoning," she said. "I'd been tracking by stars, but there was cloud cover for most of the second night. I wanted to confirm I hadn't drifted as far south as I calculated." Stroud looked at her for a long moment. "Get her below," he said. "IV fluids, full assessment." He looked at Daly. "I want a report in 30 minutes. "Yes, sir." They started moving her toward the hatch. "Commander?" Stroud stopped, turned. Tessa Kane was looking past him at the men assembled on deck. Her eyes were moving with a quiet, systematic efficiency that had nothing fevered or panicked about it. She was reading the team the way a physician reads a waiting room triage sorting without being asked. "The man in the third position from the left," she said. "The one with the red hair. How long has he been out here tonight?" Stroud followed her gaze. "Derek Marsh, 28 years old, one of his better operators, currently standing with his arms crossed and his weight shifted slightly to one side." "Same as everyone else," Stroud said. "Why pay him?" "His lips," she said. "See the color that is not windburn. That is early-stage cyanosis. His skin stopped sweating at least 20 minutes ago. You can see the salt residue dried on his neck without fresh sweat underneath it. He is past heat exhaustion. He is moving into heat stroke." Silence on the deck. Daly turned to look at Marsh. Marsh looked back at everyone looking at him. "I'm fine," he said. "You are not fine," Tessa said. Not unkindly, with the flat certainty of someone reading a chart. "Your body has stopped trying to cool itself. That is the problem. At this stage it does not feel dangerous. It feels like you are tired." Stroud said quietly, "Daly." Daly crossed to Marsh and began checking him. 30 seconds later, he looked back at Stroud with an expression that carried everything. The woman was right. Marsh's core temperature was reading 104.1 degrees. He was 90 minutes from neurological involvement. Briggs was watching all of this with his arms folded and an expression he was clearly trying to keep neutral and failing. He looked at Marsh. He looked at the woman they had just pulled from the ocean. He looked back at Marsh. Stroud said nothing. He was already revising the categories he had placed this woman in, and he had only known her for 4 minutes. "Get Marsh below," he said, "and someone bring her a dry blanket." The medical bay on the Resolute was clean and efficient, designed for field medicine at sea with everything in its place. Tessa sat on the examination table while Daly ran the IV line, and she watched him work with the attentive eyes of someone mentally checking technique against training. She did not critique him. She did not interrupt. But when he reached for the cooling pack, she said quietly, "Occipital region first, then axillary. You get better core temperature reduction that way." Daly paused, looked at her, repositioned the pack where she had indicated. "Where did you train?" he asked. "Field Medical Training Battalion at Camp Pendleton," she said. "Then Fleet Marine Force qualification." She paused briefly, and some additional training after that. He waited for elaboration. She offered none. In the other corner of the room, Derek Marsh was laid out on the second table with an IV in his arm, and Colpack's positioned correctly, now his color already improving. He was staring at the ceiling with the chastened expression of a man who had just been told by a woman pulled from the ocean 10 minutes ago that he was in medical distress he had not noticed. "You okay?" Tessa asked him. He turned his head and looked at her. "Going to be fine," he said. "Thanks to you, apparently." She nodded once. No performance of modesty, no deflection, the clean acknowledgement of one professional confirming the completion of a task. "Rest," she said. "Fluids. Do not let them clear you for full duty for at least 12 hours, regardless of how you feel." "Yes, ma'am," Marsh said. And coming from a 28-year-old SEAL operator on a medical table, it carried no irony whatsoever. The door opened and Chief Everett Wade came in. He was 47 years old and had a stillness about him that certain men develop after many years in places where noise and movement were liabilities. Not passivity. Everything contained, everything managed. Nothing leaking out that he had not decided to release. He had a weathered face and close-cropped salt and pepper hair and hands that were large and careful and looked as though they had been used for a great many purposes over a great many years. He stood in the doorway and looked at Tessa Kane. She looked back at him. Something passed between them in that exchange that Daly, watching from across the room, could not name precisely. It was recognition on one side, his, and something else on hers. Confirmation. The way a key fits a lock that has been waiting a long time. "You're alive," Wade said. "I'm alive," she agreed. Wade nodded once, slowly, as though that single fact had just resolved a question he had been carrying without showing it for longer than this conversation had existed. He left without another word. Daly looked at Tessa. "You know Chief Wade." She was looking at the door he had gone through. "Not exactly," she said. "But my father did." She said nothing more. Commander Stroud's debrief happened at 0500 hours in the operations room, 2 decks above the medical bay. The team was assembled: Briggs Wade and operators Reston Daly and Petty Officer First Class Garfield, whom everyone called Ghost for reasons no one could accurately reconstruct anymore. And Tessa Kane was there, sitting at the end of the table, wrapped in a dry Navy-issue blanket IV bag, hanging from a hook on the wall beside her core temperature, back to 97.8 and still climbing. Stroud stood at the head of the table. "She is Navy," he said. "HM2 Corpsman. Confirmed by military ID in a waterproof pouch she had in her cargo pocket." He paused. "What is not confirmed is what she was doing in the water." He looked at her. "Was Kane taking has start at the beginning?" She did not start at the beginning. She started exactly where she needed to start, giving exactly what the situation required and nothing more. Stroud would understand this later, that she never gave more than the situation required, that the architecture of her disclosure was as deliberate as everything else about her. "I was on a vessel," she said, "civilian registered. The name on the hull was the Meridian Star, but the IMO registration number does not match any vessel by that name in the current maritime database." She delivered it the way a person reads from a report they have already filed internally. "I went into the water deliberately. I had approximately 90 seconds to calculate the drift pattern and choose an entry point that would put me in range of scheduled maritime traffic within a survivable window." Silence in the room. Briggs leaned back in his chair. 90 seconds, he said. "You did all that math in 90 seconds. "Yes, in the dark. There was approximately 40% moon cover. Enough light." Briggs looked at the ceiling the way a man looks when deciding whether to say the thing he is actually thinking. He said it. "With respect, ma'am," and the ma'am had a very thin layer of genuine courtesy over a much thicker layer of professional doubt. "That is a great deal of precise calculation for someone in what I am assuming was a stressful situation." Tessa Kane looked at Colt Briggs with an expression of complete and professional calm that made the room slightly quieter just from the quality of it. "Yes," she said, "it was a stressful situation." Nothing more. Briggs opened his mouth, closed it again. Stroud moved on. "You said you went into the water deliberately," he said. "What were you leaving behind?" "People who needed information that I have," she said, "and who had decided approximately 2 hours before I left that I was more useful to them without the ability to refuse." The room processed this. "You're saying they were going to ghost started. I am saying I chose not to find out," she said. "The water was the better option." Stroud looked at her for a long moment. "What kind of information?" She met his eyes directly. "The kind I am not going to discuss in this setting," she said. "Sir?" Stroud's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger, the restraint of an experienced commander who knew that pressing harder right now would close doors that were better left open. "We will come back to that," he said. "Until then, you are a guest on my vessel, medical bay or this room. You will not go above deck without escort." He paused. "Understood." "Yes, sir," she said. He dismissed the room. As people filed out, Wade paused beside Tessa's chair. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the wall beside her with the manner of a man attending to something other than the thing he was actually attending to. In a voice low enough for only her, he said, "There is a young operator who will want to thank you when he is able. Let him. He needs to do it." She did not look up at him. "I know," she said. He walked out. Briggs was the last one through the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned back. "You saved Marsh's life tonight," he said. "I want you to know I understand that." She nodded once, and he said because he was Colt Briggs and had never left a statement at a comfortable stopping point when he could go one further. I still do not know what to make of you. That is all right, she said. You do not need to yet. He stood there 2 more seconds. Then he left. The sun came up at 06:23 hours. Tessa knew the exact time because she had been watching the horizon through the small porthole above her bunk, and she had calculated the expected sunrise based on date, latitude, and her estimated position, and the sun had arrived within 4 minutes of her calculation, which was as close as she could get without instruments. She had not slept. She had lain on the bunk with her eyes open and done what she did when sleep would not come and the mind refused to stop working. She ran the sequence again, start to finish, every step, every calculation, every decision point where something could have developed differently. The vessel had been called the Aldebaran. She had discovered its true identity 11 days ago when the civilian registration documentation proved on closer examination to have been altered. The vessel's real record was buried under 3 layers of paperwork designed to exhaust casual inquiry. She had not been casual. She had been aboard 6 days ostensibly as a marine biology research consultant hired to assess water quality samples in a stretch of Pacific that interested a company registered in Panama City with a board of directors whose names taken together formed a pattern she recognized from a briefing she had received from a man the world believed was dead. She had spent 4 of those 6 days collecting what she needed, not from computers, not from files, not from anything that could be confiscated or erased. She had spent 4 days reading, listening, and storing. Everything she took the only way it could not be taken from her. She stored it in herself. On day 5, someone noticed that she noticed too much. On day 6, in the early hours of the morning, she had gone over the rail. This was not panic. This was not improvisation. This was the contingency she had spent 3 years building against the moment it would arrive. And when it arrived, she had 90 seconds and no margin for error. She had used 87 of those 90 seconds. She had used the other 3 to take one breath, clear her mind, and enter the water, feet first at a 45-degree angle designed to minimize impact and reduce the acoustic signature of her entry. Everything after that was survival mathematics, and survival mathematics was something Tessa Kane had been learning since she was 9 years old. Derek Marsh came to find her at 0840 hours. He knocked on the medical bay door even though it was his team's space, which said something about how he had been raised. When she said, "Come in," he came in and stood with his hands at his sides, and his expression carrying the gravity of a man who understands he owes something real and is finding the right language for it. "I wanted to," he started. "You do not have to," she said. "I know." He was quiet a moment. "But I want to. I did not know how bad it was. I have been out in the heat before, and I know what it feels like," and I thought, "Heat stroke presents differently for different people," she said. "Some people feel it coming, some do not. There is no failure in not knowing your own physiology at the margins." He looked at her. "You do not have to make it easier for me," he said. She considered this. "I am not," she said. "I am telling you the clinical facts so you know what to watch for next time." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know?" he asked. "You had been in the water for 3 days. You were the one who needed attention." "How did you?" "Because that is what I do," she said. It was not a boast. It was a fact delivered in the tone of reporting weather. "I look at people and I see what is wrong. That is what every good corpsman does." Daly did not see it, he said. She did not respond to this. Marsh nodded slowly. He looked at his hands, then back at her. "Whatever they decide about you up the chain, you have got an advocate on this team," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you," she said. "That is worth something." He nodded, turned to go. "Marcia," she said. He stopped. 12 hours, she said. "I know you feel fine. 12 hours before full duty, not 11. 12. He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he meant it both times. At 10:20 hours, Colt Briggs came to the medical bay to retrieve a bandage kit that Daly had requested, and he found Tessa Kane standing at the supply cabinet examining a disassembled Glock 17 that the armorer had left there for routine maintenance. He stopped in the doorway. The Glock was in pieces on the counter in front of her. She had her back to him. She was holding the slide in her left hand and the barrel in her right, and she was examining the barrel's crown the way a gunsmith examines it with focused, unhurried attention, looking for something specific, knowing exactly what she was looking for. Her hands had the flat, absent efficiency of total familiarity. Her mind was somewhere else, which meant her mind had never needed to be involved. Her hands knew what they were doing because they had been doing it for so long that it had moved below the level of thought entirely. She set the barrel down, picked up the frame. Her fingers moved to the takedown lever, the recoil spring, the slide release. Not exploring the mechanism. Verifying condition. The way you check on something you know well, but have not seen recently. Then she reassembled it. Briggs counted the time without deciding to. A standard Glock 17 field strip and reassembly trained operator ran between 15 and 25 seconds. She was done in 9. She set the reassembled pistol on the counter, picked up the cleaning cloth beside it, and began wiping down the exterior with the same economy of motion. Briggs realized he had been standing in the doorway for almost a full minute. He stepped into the room. She turned. She looked at the Glock in her hand. She looked at him. She set it down. The armorer will want to know the extractor spring has corrosion starting, she said. Left unaddressed, it will cause ejection problems within a few hundred rounds. It is minor now. Briggs looked at the gun, looked at her. You've been trained on the Glock platform, he said. Among others, she said. Among others, he repeated carefully. What others? She turned back to the cabinet and found the bandage kit he had been sent for. She handed it to him. The armorer, she said. Extractor spring. Do not let him forget. Briggs took the kit. He stood holding it and looking at this small, quiet woman who had been floating on the open Pacific for 72 hours and had walked aboard his vessel, and in the first 40 minutes correctly diagnosed a heat emergency their own medic had missed and had just reassembled a service pistol in 9 seconds as though it were something she did between other things, and who answered direct questions by giving exactly what she had decided to give and not one syllable beyond that. Who are you, he said, genuinely asking, with the honest puzzlement of a man who has placed someone in a category and watched that category quietly, thoroughly dissolve. Tessa Kane looked at him. A corpsman, she said. That is all. She said it without edge, without the slight emphasis that would have made it a correction. She said it the way a person states a fact that is completely true and completely incomplete at the same time, and knows it and has decided that for right now in this place with this man, the incomplete version is what the situation calls for. Briggs left the room. He was not convinced. He was not supposed to be. The Resolute docked at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado at 13:47 hours. By that time, Stroud had received 2 communications from NSW Command regarding Tessa Kane. The first confirmed her service record as presented. HM2, Tessa Kane, Navy Corpsman, qualified at Field Medical Training. Battalion Fleet Marine Force, credentialed, currently assigned to a support unit whose designation and mission set were unremarkable. The second communication was a flag. Not a denial, not an alert. A flag, the bureaucratic signal that meant someone in the system had attached a marker that said in the careful language of military intelligence, look before you proceed. The flag carried one contact instruction. If this individual is recovered, contacted, or encountered in any operational context, notify the following before taking any further action. Master Chief Petty Officer Douglas Harmon, Naval Special Warfare Command, retired. Below that, a phone number. Stroud looked at this for a long time. Master Chief Douglas Harmon had retired from Naval Special Warfare Command 6 years ago. He was 61 years old, and his record was remarkable by any measure, 29 years spanning multiple SEAL teams, multiple theaters, and a number of operations that were still classified and would remain so until long after everyone involved was gone. Stroud knew him, not well but enough to know that a man like Harmon did not attach his name to a contact protocol for a junior corpsman without a reason that went considerably deeper than anything visible on the surface. He called the number. Harmon picked up on the second ring. She's alive, Stroud said without introduction. A pause on the line. I know, Harmon said. I have been tracking the thermal recovery reports out of the regional Coast Guard network since 0400. Another pause. I am 40 minutes away. I will be there. He hung up. Stroud set the phone down. He sat with his hands flat on the table and thought about the woman currently in his medical bay. About positions given in nautical coordinates in a heat emergency identified before his own medic had seen it, and a service weapon reassembled in 9 seconds as though hands had been doing it all their lives. He thought about the flag in her service file. He thought about the way Chief Everett Wade had looked at her in the medical bay. The particular weight of that look. The recognition that carried something older and heavier beneath it. Stroud had learned long ago that when a collection of facts refused to form a comfortable pattern, it was usually because the pattern they actually formed was uncomfortable. He went to find Wade. He found him on the deck outside, looking at the water with his hands behind his back and his face doing nothing at all. Chief, Stroud said. Wade turned. You know her, Stroud said, not a question. Wade looked at him for a moment with the look of a man deciding how to begin a conversation he has known was coming. I knew her father, he said. Stroud waited. Frank Kane, Wade said. Rear Admiral, SEAL Team 6, then JSOC Senior Advisor. He died in 2012. A classified operation. Horn of Africa. I know who Frank Kane was, Stroud said. Then you know how he died, Wade said, or how his death was reported. Stroud heard the weight in that phrasing and let it sit. How old was she, he said. 14, Wade said. She was 14 years old when they told her. A pause. He trained her, Wade said. Started when she was 9 years old. I was there for some of it. Not all, but enough. He looked at the water. You have seen her. You saw what she did this morning. Imagine what she was capable of at 14 with 5 years of Frank Kane's instruction in her hands. Stroud said nothing. She made a promise when he died, Wade said, to her mother. She put the other part of herself away. She went into medicine. She became exactly what her file says. She is an exceptional corpsman. He paused. But that other part does not disappear. It lives in the hands. It lives in how she moves. It lives in how she rid your team in the first 30 seconds after she came aboard. And now she is here, Stroud said. And now she is here, Wade agreed, because Wade looked at him. Because whatever she was doing on that vessel, he said, has something to do with why her father is not. Stroud held that. Harmon is coming, he said. Something moved behind Wade's eyes. Old acquaintance. Old trust. Good, he said quietly. That is good. Doug Harmon arrived at 14:31 hours. He was 61 years old and looked like a man built for a defined purpose by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had not wasted a single element of the construction. Not large in the way people expected from special operations, but compact, dense every part of him where it needed to be. He had white hair cut to the length of a thumbnail and the kind of tan that came from decades outdoors, not the tan of leisure but of exposure of being in places where shelter was an intermittent luxury. He walked onto the base the way he had walked onto bases for 30 years, like he already knew every exit. Stroud met him at the entrance to the operations building. They looked at each other the way men who have been in the same business look at each other, measuring without competition, calibrating without hostility. She's in the medical bay, Stroud said. How is she physically stabilizing well? A pause. Everything else is more complicated. Harmon almost smiled. She comes by complicated honestly, he said. They walked. The flag on her file, Stroud said. How long has it been there? 3 years, Harmon said. After the second time, she reached out to me. She had information she had been developing about Frank's death and what it was connected to. He was quiet a moment. I tried to get her to stand down. She was not interested in standing down. So you put your name on the file as the contact point, so that if something went wrong, someone would call me before the wrong people reached her first, Harmon said, flat, factual. Yes, the wrong people, Stroud said. There are people with a significant interest in the information Tessa Kane has been collecting, Harmon said carefully. Significant enough that when she stopped communicating 3 days ago, I began making calls. What kind of information? Harmon stopped walking. He looked at Stroud directly. The kind that exists in no file, he said. The kind that lives only in one person's memory and cannot be copied, transmitted, or extracted by any means that does not require that person's cooperation. A pause. She designed it that way deliberately. Stroud thought about the hull plate, the 90-second window, dead reckoning by starlight through 40% cloud cover. He thought about a 14-year-old girl receiving a flag instead of a father. He thought about what a person might spend 14 years quietly, patiently preparing to do. She planned to be found, Stroud said. Harmon looked at him. She planned to be found by the right people, he said. There is a considerable difference. They began walking again. Ahead of them in the medical bay, Tessa Kane was sitting up on the examination table with her IV removed and her color restored, and her dark hair still salt-matted, but her eyes clear and rested in the way that people who have learned to sleep in windows are rested, and she was waiting. She had been waiting in one form or another for a very long time. In the corridor outside the medical bay, Colt Briggs was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, which was where he had been for the last 20 minutes. Not because anyone had asked him, because he had been trying to assemble the events of the past several hours into a coherent shape and had found that standing near the source of his confusion was preferable to standing far from it. He heard footsteps coming down the corridor. He straightened up. Stroud rounded the corner with Harmon beside him, and Briggs came to attention automatically. And then he looked at Harmon and he looked at Stroud. And he said in the voice of a man who has just understood that the thing he was looking at is considerably larger than it appeared. "This is serious, sir." "Yes," Stroud said, "it is." Briggs nodded once, slowly adjusting his posture to carry the weight of that confirmation properly. "Okay," he said. He stepped aside from the door. Stroud put his hand on the handle. He thought about the flag, about Harmon, about Wade, about 72 hours on the Pacific and 9 seconds to reassemble a service pistol and a core temperature that should have had a person barely conscious but had not. He thought about the way she had read his entire team in the first 30 seconds after coming aboard. Systematic, unhurried, looking for someone specific. He opened the door. Tessa Kane looked up. She looked at Stroud. She looked at Harmon. Something in her face changed, not dramatically, not the way a person's face changes when they break open. The way a face changes when a load that has been carried for a very long time is for the first time transferred to ground that can hold it. It passed quickly. "Master Chief," she said. Harmon stepped forward. He stopped in front of her and looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has been worried about for a long time and has just been given permission to stop worrying about. "You made it," he said. "I made it," she said. A silence between them that carried more history than the room had space for. Then she looked at Stroud. "There are things you need to know," she said. "Things that cannot wait because the man who is going to come looking for what I carry will be here soon, and when he arrives, the window for doing this correctly will close." She paused. "I need you to listen. All of it. And I need you to understand that what I am about to tell you will change the shape of what you thought you knew." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" Stroud pulled a chair from the corner and sat in it. "Start at the beginning," he said. Outside in the corridor, Colt Briggs stood with his back against the wall and his arms still crossed, and he looked at the closed door, and he thought about a woman reassembling a pistol in 9 seconds and reading a heat emergency in 4, and surviving 3 days alone on the Pacific with nothing but a piece of hull plating and the stars. He thought about how she had said, "I am a corpsman. That is all." He thought about how it had sounded completely true, and how it had also sounded like the smallest fraction of a much larger, older, more complicated truth. He stayed where he was. He was not going anywhere. Not until he understood what they had pulled out of the water. Not until he understood what Tessa Kane had been carrying alone across all that dark and open sea for 72 hours and 14 years. She talked for 47 minutes. Stroud sat in his chair and listened without interrupting. Harmon stood with his back against the wall and listened the way he had listened to operational briefings for 30 years, not passively, but with everything engaged, every detail placed carefully in its correct position, relative to every other detail. Tessa Kane spoke without notes, without hesitation, without the verbal stumbling of someone reconstructing events from uncertain memory. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed something so many times that the rehearsal is over and what remains is simply the truth in its cleanest form. She told them about the vessel, about the 6 days aboard, about what she had been looking for and the method she had used to find it. She told them about the moment she understood the window for safe departure had closed. She told them about the water. What she did not tell them yet was what the information was. She gave them the frame without the picture, the architecture without the contents, enough to understand the shape of the thing, not enough to hold it without her. Stroud noticed this and did not push. There was a skill to debriefing that took years to develop and that many commanders who were very good at other aspects of leadership never fully acquired. The skill of understanding when the person across from you was giving exactly what they intended to give right now and that pressing for more would produce less. Tessa Kane was building something deliberate, and the order of construction mattered. He let her build it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Harmon said, "You should eat something." She looked at him. "You have been in the water for 3 days," he said. "Whatever comes next, you need fuel." The complete absence of drama in it made something in her settle that Stroud had not realized was coiled. She nodded once. Stroud called for food to be brought. While they waited, Wade came to the door. He looked at Harmon with the brief economical exchange of two men who had navigated difficult situations together before and were in one again. Harmon gave a small nod that meant she has told them what she intends to tell them, and it is enough for now. Wade stayed in the doorway. They were in the middle of an early meal that nobody was eating with any real appetite when the radio on Stroud's hip broke the silence. It was Lieutenant Commander Perry from Team 6, and the words he used were the compressed, clipped shorthand that meant a situation had moved from manageable to urgent. A joint training operation in the coastal range outside San Diego had made contact with an active threat, not a scenario. Someone real with real intent who had positioned himself on elevated ground approximately 800 meters from the primary operating area and had already put 2 rounds downrange. One graze wound on an operator named Hutchins, one miss on a vehicle. The team was pinned. Their own sniper petty officer Garrett had taken a ricochet fragment to the right forearm. Not life-threatening, completely disabling for the task at hand. They needed a qualified sniper. They needed one in the next 30 minutes. Stroud was already moving before the transmission finished. He looked around the room. Daly was capable at range, but had never qualified above 700 meters in a field setting. Reston was stronger at close quarters. Ghost could shoot, but not at this distance and not in these conditions. He looked at Tessa Kane. She had set her food down and was looking at him. Not with eagerness. Not with the lit-up expression of someone who had been waiting for permission to do the thing they wanted. With the measuring steadiness of someone calculating whether the conditions justified a decision long since made in principle. 800 meters, she said. Approximately, Stroud said. Conditions, elevated position. Some crosswind direction unknown from here. Daylight. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Who has the sniper's rifle? She asked. Barrett M82A1, Stroud said. 50 caliber. A pause that was not hesitation but assessment. All right, she said. Briggs appeared in the doorway because of course he did. Sir, he said carefully. With respect. Not now, Brig, Stroud said. Sir, she has been into the water for 3 days. She is on IF recovery. She has not. Briggs, silence. Sir, Briggs said and closed his mouth. Stroud looked at Tessa. Can you do this? She had already stood up. She was looking at her hands, turning them over, once palms up, then palms down. Not checking for tremor in any obvious way, checking in the way a craftsman examines tools before use, the way a surgeon looks at his hands before he begins. Yes, she said. They moved. The drive took 22 minutes. In the back of the vehicle, Tessa sat across from Briggs. He sat with his arms on his knees and his eyes on her. His expression one that had shifted several times today and had not yet found its resting place. He was watching her the way a man watches something he has placed in one category and is observing migrate steadily and undeniably toward a different one. She was not looking at him. She was looking at her hands, both of them resting flat on her thighs, and she was doing something with her breathing. Slow, deliberate, counted. Not the management of anxiety, preparation. The purposeful settling that surgeons perform before incision, that men with long experience in combat learn before the moment arrives, whether they are ready or not. Briggs watched the breathing pattern. He had seen that pattern before. He had used it himself. He said nothing. Marsh was in the vehicle, too cleared for light duty, over Tessa's stated objection of 12 hours minimum, sitting quietly and watching her in a way that was different from how Briggs was watching. Marsh was not trying to categorize her. He was simply watching the way a person watches someone they have decided they trust. Wade sat at the front beside the driver looking at the road. The Barrett was in a case between Tessa's feet. 30 pounds of precision engineering, chambered in 50 caliber bipod-mounted scope, zeroed at a distance she would have to adjust from based on conditions she could not fully assess until she was on the ground. The recoil impulse on a Barrett M82A1 was significant enough that the manual included specific warnings about shoulder positioning and the consequences of improper grip at the moment of discharge. She knew the recoil profile. She knew the muzzle rise. She knew how a 50 caliber round behaved through a standard temperature gradient in coastal California air and the adjustment required for a crosswind of 8 to 12 knots at range. She knew these things because they had been put into her hands the way language is given to a child, not as rules to memorize, but as a way of existing in the world, a lens through which everything became more precise. She had not used this lens in 14 years. She had kept it locked in a room, in herself, the door painted over, furniture placed in front. She had been a corpsman and only a corpsman, and she had been excellent at it, and she had told herself this was enough. She had believed this. Mostly. The way you believe a thing that is partially but not entirely true if you do not look at it too directly for too long. The vehicle stopped. She picked up the case. She got out. The elevated position was a natural ridgeline southeast facing at the edge of a dry creek bed that cut through the coastal range like an old scar. The team had identified the shooter's probable location based on shot angle, a rock formation at 9 o'clock from the primary operating area, approximately 820 meters distant, by laser rangefinder. 820 meters. Tessa found her position without being directed to it. She walked the ridgeline for 40 seconds, reading terrain, with the focused, tilted attention of someone who had been taught to see ground, the way ground wanted to be used, and then she stopped and crouched. Here, she said. Stroud looked at where she was crouching. He looked at the sight line. He looked at the rock formation. He said nothing. She opened the case. Briggs stood 10 feet behind her with his arms crossed and his jaw tight and an expression doing its best to remain professionally neutral and losing the fight to something that caught at the right angle looked like anticipation. Tessa lifted the Barrett from its case. She handled the 30.4 pounds without ceremony, without the brief adjustment people make when lifting something heavier than expected, because it was not heavier than she expected. She knew exactly how much it weighed. She had known since she was 16. She set it on the bipod. She got behind it. She looked through the scope. The rock formation came into sharp definition at 10 power. The shooter's position was a gap between two large boulders, east facing good cover on three sides, clear line of sight to the operating area. She could see the barrel of his rifle at the edge of the gap. She could see with the detail that a trained eye extracted from a 10-power scope the protrusion of a shoulder. Not enough. She needed him to move. Every person in a static shooting position eventually moved because the human body did not maintain absolute stillness indefinitely, and every movement revealed geometry, and geometry was information. She settled in to wait. 30 seconds. 40. 1 minute, she breathed. 4 counts in long, hold, slow release. Her heart rate was dropping through the numbers she needed it to drop through, not through force, but through a physiological discipline, as automatic as any other trained response, as deeply written into her, as the ability to find a femoral artery in the dark. 68 beats per minute, 65, 62. The shoulder at the edge of the bomb shifted. Not much, 3, maybe 4 inches. The shift a body makes when a position has been held too long and weight distribution needs to compensate. It was enough. She exhaled to the natural empty space at the bottom of a breath. She squeezed. The Barrett fired. The recoil was exactly what she had known it would be, a massive rolling push that started at the shoulder and moved through the entire body if you allowed it. She had been taught very specifically not to allow it. She absorbed it in the mechanics her father had built into her over hundreds of rounds through a rifle like this one on early mornings in Montana when she was 16, and the mountains were blue with cold, and he had stood behind her and said, "The recoil is information about the shot you just fired. Treat it as data." The round struck the rock face 2 feet left of the gap, high left. The wind was stronger than the 12-knot estimate. She had the data now. She worked the bolt, adjusted. She watched a stand of brush at the 400-meter line and recalculated the wind in real time. She found the bottom of her exhale. She squeezed. 820 meters. The rifle at the edge of the gap disappeared. The sound from behind her was not quite human speech and not quite silence, but something between the involuntary output of several people processing the same piece of information at the same time and not quite managing it. Stroud, through his own scope, confirmed the shooter was down, weapon clear position, vacated. He lowered the scope. He looked at the back of Tessa Kane's head. She was working the bolt again, checking the chamber, engaging the safety in the practiced sequence of someone for whom weapons handling was reflex. She stood up, turned. Briggs was staring at her. Marsh was staring at her. Ghost, who had moved up during the wait, was staring at her. Reston, who had arrived from the pinned position 30 seconds earlier and had missed the first shot but not the second, was staring at her. She looked at all of them looking at her. "The first shot was mine," she said. "Wind was higher than the estimate. Second shot corrected." Silence. Then Marsh said very quietly, 820 meters. "Yes." "Cold barrel, no spotter." "Yes." Briggs unfolded his arms. He looked at the rock formation 820 meters away. He looked back at her. "Where did you learn that?" he said. She looked at him. "My father taught me," she said. It was the same construction she had used for everything else. The same economy, the same delivery that gave you the fact without the story. But this time something in it was different. Something small. Something only visible to a person who had been watching her long enough to know the difference between her face doing what she intended and her face carrying something she had not entirely managed to stop. It was grief, very brief, very controlled. Gone in less than a second. But Briggs saw it. He filed it in the part of his mind that stored unresolved questions and moved to the next thing. Stroud said, "Let's get back." They went back. The debrief on the shooting was brief because the outcome was not ambiguous. A threat had been neutralized. No casualties on the team. Stroud handed the downstream inquiry to the appropriate parties and turned back to the question at the center of the day. Tessa Kane. He had already sent a full background query to NSW Command. The response arrived in two parts, which was itself information. Single-part responses meant nothing unusual. Two-part responses meant something in the record had been separated from the rest of it. The first part was the same service record he had seen before. The second part was what he had started to expect. File designation, compartmented access, clearance requirement C, I-4 or above. Below that, a single line of visible text before the encryption wall. Personnel associated with this file are subject to DIA notification protocol upon any official contact. And below that, one name, Director Alan Vickers, Defense Intelligence Agency Senior Advisory Division. Stroud looked at that name for a long time. He knew it. Most people who had spent enough time in the space between military and intelligence functions knew it. Alan Vickers had been a fixture in defense intelligence circles for 3 decades. The kind of career that was mostly invisible to everyone, not in the rooms where it happened, which was exactly what a career in defense intelligence was supposed to look like. Quiet, durable, always present at the point where information became decision. He went to find Harmon. He found him in the corridor outside the medical bay with a cup of coffee he was not drinking. Vickers, Stroud said. Harmon's expression did something very small and very controlled. Yes, he said. His name is on her restricted file. DIA notification protocol. What does that mean? Harmon set the cup down on the nearest flat surface. It means someone at the Defense Intelligence Agency has a defined interest in knowing where she is and what she has been doing, he said carefully. And it means that interest predates her becoming a corpsman. Stroud looked at him. Frank Kane, he said. Yes. What was the connection between Kane and Vickers? Harmon was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man weighing words. Frank Kane was one of the finest officers I served with in 29 years, he said, and in 2012 he found something he was not meant to find. He paused. He was dead within 3 months of finding it. No body, Stroud said. Harmon met his gaze. No body, he confirmed. The official report cited operational conditions. Hazardous terrain, rapid egress. The standard language that means we are not providing details. And Vickers was the senior intelligence officer overseeing the program that Kane's operation intersected with, Harmon said. In official terms, Kane's indirect superior in the intelligence chain for that specific mission set. Stroud absorbed this. You are telling me that the man on her restricted file as a notification contact is the same man who was running the intelligence program when her father died. I am telling you those two facts are both true, Harmon said. I am not in this corridor at this time telling you they are connected, because I cannot do that without her permission. Stroud looked at the door to the medical bay. She needs to know about the notification protocol, he said. Yes, Harmon said. She does. They went in. Tessa was not resting. She was sitting up with her feet on the floor and her hands in her lap, looking at the wall opposite, with an expression doing what her expressions usually did, giving away almost nothing and giving what it gave with precision. She looked up when they entered. She looked at Stroud. She looked at Harmon. And then she said before either of them spoke, his name is on the file. It was not a question. Stroud stopped. You knew, I knew it would be there, she said. I did not know when they placed it, but yes. She was quiet a moment. I have been waiting for someone with sufficient clearance to run a full background query since I came aboard. Stroud looked at her. You wanted me to find it. I needed someone with enough rank and institutional credibility to find it, she said. Yes. Stroud pulled a chair, sat, and looked at her directly. Tessa, he said, using her name without rank for the first time. I need you to tell me what Alan Vickers is to you. She looked at Harmon. Harmon gave a small nod. She looked at Stroud, and she began to tell him the part she had not told him yet. Her father had been 43 years old when he died, or when he was reported as dead. She had been 14. Her mother had come into her room at 6 in the morning with a face that had gone completely white, not pale, not shocked, but white, the color of something from which all blood has departed at once. And she had sat on the edge of the bed and taken both of Tessa's hands in hers. Tessa had not cried. Not then, not in front of her mother. Not because she was not destroyed by it, but because crying was something she could do later alone. And right now her mother needed from her the particular kind of steadiness that her father had spent 5 years building into her without ever explicitly naming what he was building. He had simply built it. She had understood later that this was deliberate. The training had been many things simultaneously. the transmission of skill, of knowledge, of discipline, of a way of moving through the world. But one of the things that had been perhaps the most important was the creation of a person who could handle what was coming. He had known something was coming. She understood this in retrospect, the urgency always present in the sessions, even the early ones. The care he had taken to teach her not just the physical skills, but the cognitive architecture that made them useful. How to read a room, assess a situation, strip out noise and locate signal, survive with minimum resources and maximum clarity. He had known. He had prepared her. And then he had gone and not come back. She had kept her promise to her mother, the promise made without knowing exactly what it cost until many years later. She had gone into medicine. She had become exactly what her file said. She was an exceptional corpsman. She had put the other part of herself in that locked room and left it there. She had been 22 when she made contact with Harmon. Not because of anything dramatic. Because she had been going through a file box her mother had kept 3 years after her mother's death from an illness that moved fast and gave them no time for a proper goodbye, and she had found a folded piece of paper in her father's handwriting. Not a letter, a name, Douglas Harmon, and below it a number, and below that in the same careful handwriting, when you are ready. Not before. She had been ready. She had called. Harmon had answered. What followed was 2 years of careful, methodical work that she did mostly alone, with the discipline her father had given her. The discipline that did not rush, that did not announce itself, that moved forward, the way glaciers move steadily, consistently, and with the eventual inevitability of changing the shape of everything in its path. She built the picture, piece by piece, a classified operation in October of 1993. A unit of 11 SEAL operators running a parallel mission in the Horn of Africa, a mission that had nothing to do with the events in Mogadishu happening simultaneously and everything to do with a separate intelligence objective whose details had been buried so thoroughly that the only traces existed in documents that had been misfiled, partially redacted, or quietly moved to archival storage where they would not be looked for. The 11 operators had been compromised, not by enemy intelligence, not by operational failure, by someone who had given their position to the opposing side deliberately, carefully, and with full knowledge of what would happen when that information was received. 8 of the 11 died. 3 survived by chance, by the grace of being in slightly wrong positions when the engagement began, in positions that turned out to be survivable while the correct positions did not. The person who had given the position had a designation, a code name that appeared if you knew where to look and how to read fragmentary evidence in a small number of documents from the period. Cardinal. She had been building toward that name for 3 years when she found the vessel, when she placed herself in a position to board it, when she spent 6 days in a space that was dangerous and growing more so, collecting what she needed before the window closed. She was not collecting documents. She was collecting confirmation. The final piece that would allow her to place the code name Cardinal on a specific face, a specific record, a specific man who was currently a senior advisory figure at the Defense Intelligence Agency and whose name appeared on the restricted file of a Navy corpsman whose father he had arranged to silence. She stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Stroud had not moved during the 20 minutes she had been speaking. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on her the entire time. Harmon had moved to the chair beside the door and was sitting with his forearms on his thighs and his eyes on the floor. "You said arranged to silence," Stroud said carefully. She met his eyes. "My father did not die in 2012, she said. The air in the room shifted. "He faked his death," she said, "with help, because the alternative was not faking it." A pause. Cardinal became aware that he was building a case. He had found information that, properly documented and presented to the right oversight body, would have been sufficient to open a formal investigation. She paused again. Cardinal moved to close that possibility. "And your father knew," Stroud said. "Yes." "So he went first." "He chose to disappear rather than die," she said. "He chose to buy time." "How long has he been?" 14 years, she said. The weight of it sat between them. Stroud looked at Harmon. Harmon met his gaze. "You knew," Stroud said. "I knew enough," Harmon said. "Enough to understand that Frank Kane was not the kind of man who died in a way that left no body and no explanation. Not enough to act." He looked at Tessa. "I knew that when his daughter called me, she was further along than I was." Stroud sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Tessa. "Where is he now?" "Somewhere safe," she said. "He will stay there until the information I am carrying cannot be suppressed, until the right oversight authority has it and has acted on it." She paused. That was the arrangement. He stays invisible until the moment it is safe for him not to be. Because if Cardinal believes Frank Kane is alive before we reach that moment, the information disappears. Every trace, every document, every surviving witness. Witness, Stroud said. The three who survived the 1993 operation. She held his gaze. Yes. They are still alive. Yes, my father spent years locating them. They are prepared to testify. Their accounts combined with the documentation he has compiled and the information I carry from the Aldebaran are sufficient. She paused. Sufficient to end this. The door opened. Wade came in. He looked at Tessa, then at Stroud, and read the room in approximately 3 seconds. He moved to stand near Tessa. Close enough. She told you, he said. Most of it, Stroud said. Wade nodded slowly. There is a part she has not told you, he said. He looked at Tessa. Permission. She was quiet a moment, then she nodded. Wade looked at Stroud. I was there, he said, in 2007, when Frank first put a rifle in her hands. He paused. I was Petty Officer First Class Wade SEAL Team 6, assigned as personal security for an admiral who was moving through territory that made personal security necessary rather than ceremonial. He looked at the floor briefly. I watched him teach her. Session after session over 3 years, I watched what he was building. Another pause. And I understood what it meant. Briggs had appeared in the doorway at some point. No one had asked him to come. He was there anyway. It meant, Wade continued, that I was not surprised today when she picked up that Barrett. He looked at Tessa with an expression that carried long acquaintance and long respect in equal measure. I was not surprised. I was relieved. Tessa looked at him. You never said anything, she said. Because you needed to decide for yourself, he said, whether the time was now, whether you were ready to use what he gave you. You have been waiting, she said, since I found your name in the thermal recovery report at 0400 this morning, he said. Yes. A pause. You have been on this team for 8 months, Wade said. I requested the transfer. He held her gaze. I have been watching the situation develop through Harmon for 2 years. When the indicators suggested you were moving toward the final phase, I requested the transfer to Team 8. She was very still. You placed yourself here, she said, knowing I might surface. I placed myself here, knowing that if you surfaced in the right location, you would need someone who could confirm your identity without going through official channels that Cardinal has access to. He paused. And because your father asked me to. The silence that followed was not empty. Tessa Kane looked at Chief Everett Wade, and for the second time since she had been brought aboard, something moved through her face that she had not entirely managed to stop. Not grief this time. Something older than grief and more complicated. Something in the territory of understanding finally after a long time carrying a weight alone, that you had never entirely been alone with it. She looked down at her hands, turned them over once, turned them back. The first shot today, she said quietly. Left and high, I miscalculated the wind. You corrected, Wade said. Yes. And the second shot, she met his eyes. 820 meters, she said, clean. Wade nodded once. Your father, he said, would not be surprised. She held that for a moment, then she set her hands flat on her thighs and straightened her spine and looked at Stroud, and whatever window had briefly opened, closed quietly and firmly, and she was back, composed, precise, ready for the next thing required. There is more to tell you, she said. The information I am carrying, the names, the accounts, the financial architecture. She paused. And I need to tell you soon because the notification protocol on my file means that someone at DIA has already been alerted to my official contact. Cardinal will know I have surfaced within hours if he does not already. Stroud looked at her. Then tell us, he said. She took one breath. She began. The Somalia operation had taken place on the 3rd of October, 1993. On that same day, in the more documented corridor of history, events in Mogadishu were consuming the attention of the military, the intelligence community, and the American public in ways that would resonate for decades. What those events did, among many other things, was create a period of intense noise in which quieter things could happen without observation. The 11-man unit had been operating under a separate mission designation in a separate area under an intelligence directive issued through a compartmented channel rather than standard military command structure. The directive had come from a senior intelligence officer in the civilian intelligence community who held authority over the specific program the unit was supporting. The unit had been given a set of coordinates. The coordinates placed them in a location understood from available intelligence to be clear of opposing forces. The intelligence was wrong. Not incorrectly assessed, not a failure of analysis. Wrong because the assessment had been deliberately corrupted. The coordinates had been given to a party with opposing interests at the same time they were given to the unit. The unit arrived to find they were expected. Of the 11, 8 died in the first 7 minutes. The 3 who survived did so by not being where they were supposed to be when the engagement began. One had stopped to address a minor equipment issue. One had taken a position slightly back from the forward element to observe the approach route. One had simply moved at the wrong moment in a direction that turned out to be the right one. 3 survivors, 8 dead. A mission that had no official existence conducted under intelligence authority that carried no accountability, producing casualties that had to be explained through other means. The financial dimension was quieter still. The program the unit had been supporting was connected to a funding mechanism not subject to standard congressional oversight, a discretionary fund managed through layers of institutional cover that had been accumulating resources from multiple sources for purposes not entirely aligned with the official description of those purposes. When Tessa named the accounts, she named them the way she named everything. 3 accounts, 2 holding institutions, 1 in the Cayman Islands, 1 in Liechtenstein, 1 corporate vehicle registered in Delaware with nominee directors, and a paper trail that led nowhere unless you followed it through 4 generations of shell structure to the beneficial owner, whose name was also the name of the senior intelligence officer who had issued the original mission directive. She named the accounts. She named the corporate vehicle. She named the beneficial owner. Alan Vickers. The room was different after she said it, not louder. The quality of the air changed when a thing that has existed as a shape suspected half known, present only as implication, is given a name and becomes real and cannot be returned to the category of the possible. Briggs in the doorway had both hands flat against the frame on either side of him. Marsh, who had come in at some point during the telling, was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his arms resting on his knees. Stroud had not moved. He said after a long silence, "You have all of this in your memory." "Yes," she said. "Account numbers, corporate registrations, the complete chain." "Yes." "And the witness accounts from the 3 survivors." "My father compiled them and transmitted them to me over several years through a channel that will be difficult but not impossible to trace, which is why we are working on a timeline." She paused. "The survivors are prepared to speak. They have been prepared for 2 years. They are waiting for the signal." "What is the signal?" "Me," she said. "Alive and in a protected position with access to an oversight authority that Cardinal cannot reach before the record is placed." Stroud looked at Harmon. Harmon looked at Tessa. "Patricia Ellsworth," Harmon said. "Not a question." "Yes," Tessa said. Harmon nodded slowly. "She has been waiting too." Tessa looked at Stroud. "Patricia Ellsworth is a military attorney currently working with a veterans' rights organization in Washington. She has a relationship with a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee who is outside Cardinal's sphere of influence. She can move the record into a protected oversight channel before any DIA notification can intercept it." A pause. "I need communication access and time." Stroud said, "How much time?" "Enough to reach her and transmit the record. After that, it is outside my hands. If Vickers gets notification that you have been officially contacted, he will move to neutralize the information," she said. "Yes, before it can be placed." She held Stroud's gaze. "Which is why what happens in the next several hours matters more than everything that has come before." She said it without drama, with the same flat, clear steadiness she had used to diagnose a heat emergency on a deck at 0340 hours and to call the wind adjustment between 2 shots at 820 meters. Same voice, different weight. Stroud looked at his team, at Harmon, at Wade, at Briggs in the doorway, whose expression had traveled an enormous distance since this morning. He looked at Tessa Kane. He thought about the hull plate in the dark Pacific. He thought about 9 seconds to reassemble a service pistol. He thought about what it cost to carry something alone for 14 years. "All right," he said. He stood up. "Here is what we are going to do." He was about to continue when Ghost came through the door, and his face said that planning time had just been cut significantly. "The Aldebaran," Ghost said. "Coast Guard Intelligence has a vessel matching her profile and registry history running dark 11 nautical miles out. No AIS transponder. Speed and bearing are consistent with intentional approach." Tessa was on her feet before he finished. Not from surprise, from the recognition of a contingency she had calculated and assigned a high probability to, and the body's execution of a response plan filed where things go when they no longer require conscious retrieval. They tracked the recovery signal, she said. When my thermal signature appeared in the regional network, anyone monitoring would have had our approximate position. She looked at Stroud. They want to confirm I have not talked, or they want to make sure the opportunity to do so passes. Time to effective range, Stroud said to Ghost. 40 minutes at current speed and heading. Stroud looked at Wade. Wade had already moved to the base map pinned to the wall. Northeast seawall, Wade said. 40 feet of elevation. Clear sightline to 12 miles. Stroud looked at Tessa. She was already looking at the Barrett case. Her left shoulder from the afternoon's operation was functional. The wrap Briggs had applied was holding. She had checked the arm twice in the last hour without making a performance of it. Wind, she asked. Ghost was already on his phone. Northwest 14 knots, gusting to 18. She ran the arithmetic behind her eyes. Manageable, she said. They moved. The seawall at night was a different place from the seawall at noon. The Pacific had gone dark under an overcast moving in from the northwest, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees and the wind was exactly what the forecast had called gusty and inconsistent in the way coastal winds became inconsistent when a pressure system was building offshore. She felt it on her face and read it the way her father had taught her to read it, not with instruments, but with the sum of what skin and ears and the behavior of the water below could tell. She sat up on the low wall, bipod on concrete, cheek to stock, eye to scope. The Aldebaran came into focus at 10 power. She recognized it immediately. The configuration of running lights, the profile of the superstructure, the precise way the bow met the water at speed. 6 days of proximity had put the vessel's geometry into memory with the permanence of things learned in high-stakes conditions. She ranged it, 1,140 meters. Closing. Behind her, Wade and Briggs had taken positions at the edge of the seawall. Ghost was on the radio. Marsh stood back and to the left watching through binoculars. She had been in position less than a minute when the incoming round arrived. Not at her, slightly left, slightly high, the landing pattern of a first shot from a moving platform at range, when the shooter is still solving the geometry and the platform is still closing the distance. But close enough that the supersonic crack was a physical pressure against the left side of her face, and the concrete the round struck sent a fragment outward, irregular and fast, that caught the outside of her left shoulder. She knew immediately. Not the round itself fragment. She completed the assessment in the time it took to draw one breath, arm still at full range of motion, shoulder still bearing weight, which meant the damage was surface and muscle and not bone and not joint. Bleeding. Pain in the clean, precise way of a fresh wound before the adrenaline fully decides how much of it to transmit. She did not move. Briggs was already beside her, not to pull her back, but to cover her position. The correct instinct, she noted it without comment. 1,160, she said. The vessel had closed in the seconds since she had ranged it. 14-knot wind from the northwest with gusts to 18. She had felt 3 gust cycles in the last 90 seconds, and the interval had a pattern she could use. Her left arm was the support arm, taking the forward weight of the Barrett on its bipod. She could feel the shoulder wanting to compensate for the wound, redistributing load in the automatic way injured tissue tried to protect itself. She directed it not to compensate because compensation at this distance would express itself in the flight path of the round as clearly as if she had introduced the error by intention. She waited for the gust cycle to pass. In the space between gusts, she found the bottom of her exhale. She squeezed, 1,160 meters. The forward position on the Aldebaran went dark. No second shot came from the vessel. Briggs crouched beside her immediately, hands moving to the shoulder, with the assessment efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was examining. Fragment, she told him before he asked. Muscle. I need 2 minutes. 1, he said, then I am wrapping it. She kept the scope on the vessel for the full 60 seconds. The Aldebaran's course was changing. Slowly, without urgency, the way a vessel changed course when it had determined the objective was no longer viable and did not wish to make that determination visible. They were not coming anymore. She let Briggs wrap the shoulder. He worked quickly and correctly and without speaking, and when he finished, she tested the arm's range of motion twice and found it adequate. Thank you, she said. He said nothing, but the way he said nothing carried more than most people conveyed in full sentences. They went back inside. She stood in the operations room with the wrapped shoulder and the weight of what she was carrying, and she looked at Stroud. Cardinal knows I have surfaced, she said. The vessel was confirmation. We are out of time for preparation. She paused. I need to reach Patricia Ellsworth now. Stroud looked at her. Then tell us the rest, he said, and then we reach her. She took a breath. She told them the rest. Stroud's plan was not complicated. The best plans rarely were. Complexity was what happened when there was too much time and too many people and too much distance from the actual problem. When you were close to the problem, when it had texture and weight and a timeline measured in hours rather than days, what worked was simple, clear, built from the capabilities of the people in the room. He had Harmon, whose clearance level and institutional standing gave him access to communication infrastructure that could not be monitored through standard DIA protocols without a court order that would take longer to obtain than they had. He had Wade, whose relationship with Tessa and knowledge of Frank Kane's work provided the authentication any oversight body would require before acting on information of this magnitude. He had Patricia Elworth's contact information and the knowledge that she had been waiting for this call. And he had Tessa Kane, who carried in her memory the complete verified record of a 30-year crime and the name of the man who had committed it. What he needed was time and a secure line. He sent Reston to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado to requisition access to the Cybernet communications facility. He kept Harmon to draft authentication documentation. He asked Wade to stay with Tessa. He was working through the logistics when Briggs appeared at his elbow. "Sir," Briggs said quietly. "A minute." They stepped into the corridor. Briggs stood with his arms at his sides, which was enough of a departure from his usual posture that it registered. He had spent most of the day with his arms crossed, the position of a man holding himself together around a series of revisions to his worldview. Arms at his sides meant something had settled. "I was wrong about her," he said. "This morning on the deck, I was wrong about what I was looking at." Stroud waited. "I want to be useful for whatever comes next," Briggs said. "Not on the perimeter." Stroud looked at him. "You were doing your job this morning," he said. "I was doing my job poorly." Briggs said, "There is a difference." Stroud held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then he nodded. "In the room," he said. They went back in. The 40 minutes stretched. Tessa waited the way she had learned to wait on the hull plate, not with the restless energy of a person fighting time, but with the conserving stillness of someone who knew that what came after the waiting would require everything, and that spending resources on the waiting itself was waste she could not afford. Wade sat across from her. He had produced 2 cups of coffee from somewhere, setting one in front of her without ceremony, and she drank it without ceremony, and for several minutes neither of them spoke, and the silence was the kind that exists between people who have shared something large enough that ordinary words have no useful relationship to it. Harmon was at the table beside Stroud, drafting authentication documentation, his handwriting precise and unhurried. Briggs was at the door. Marsh came in and sat against the wall and did not try to contribute anything because he was intelligent enough to understand that his contribution, when it was needed, would be clear, and until then his job was to be present and ready. At the 31-minute mark, Wade said to Tessa, "He talked about you, you know, in the time I was attached to him. He would not have said so directly, that was not how he communicated, but he found reasons to bring you into the conversation. Your progress. Something you had observed that surprised him. Something you had done correctly the first time without instruction." He paused. The way a man mentions something he is proud of when he has decided that displaying the pride directly would embarrass the subject. Tessa looked at the Kingpy cup in her hands. "I know," she said. "He was always thinking about how to protect you," Wade said, even when the protection looked like instruction. She was quiet for a moment. "The rifle," she said. "He spent 3 years teaching me a skill, and then 2 years teaching me when not to use it. That was the harder lesson, the restraint." "Yes," Wade said. "He said once that the most important decision a person with this particular capability ever makes is the decision to wait, that the skill itself was nothing, that the judgment about when it was necessary was everything." Wade nodded slowly. 14 years, she said. "I kept both promises, to my mother and to myself." "I know. Today was the first time I used what he gave me." Wade looked at her. "You did not break a promise," he said. "You fulfilled the version of it your father intended when he put it in your hands." She held that. She was about to respond when Ghost came through the door at a pace that said the situation had changed. "Commander," Ghost said, "vehicle approaching the gate, 3 occupants, DIA credentials." The room changed, not dramatically. The people in it did what trained people do. When the thing they have been preparing for arrives, they adjusted. The way equipment adjusts when power is applied. Everything that had been at rest moved toward readiness without anyone announcing it. Stroud was on his feet. "How long?" he said. 8 to 12 minutes before they clear the gate and reach this building." Stroud looked at Harmon. "Documentation close," Harmon said. still writing pace unchanged. Stroud looked at Tessa. She was already standing. I need the secure line now, she said. Not in 40 minutes, now. Reston has not confirmed the facility yet. Then we use another way, she said. Harmon. She looked at him. Your personal secure channel, the one you maintained for running assets out of Bagram. The infrastructure still exists. Harmon stopped writing, looked at her. Your father told you about that, he said. He told me about a great many things, she said. A pause. It runs 2 levels below DIA monitoring threshold, he said. Technically retired from active use, but the infrastructure is intact. Can you access it from here? With the right authentication, he said, which I have. She looked at Stroud. Stroud had 8 minutes to evaluate risk across an imperfect field of options. The channel was technically retired. The authentication was intact. The alternative was a DIA-monitored facility through which Vickers would receive real-time notification of everything transmitted. Do it, he said. Harmon reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a laminated card with a sequence of characters that had been memorized so thoroughly it no longer required reading but was written down anyway, because Douglas Harmon had been in enough situations where memory had decided to be elsewhere to have learned not to rely on it entirely. He moved to the communications terminal. Tessa moved with him. She stood at his shoulder and watched the screen with the attentive focus of someone monitoring a process they understood, and when Harmon hesitated once over a character sequence, she said it before he could, and he entered it without looking up because she was correct and they both knew it. The channel opened. She took the handset. Patricia Ellsworth answered on the 3rd ring, and the sound of her voice made something shift in Tessa's posture that was not visible as an expression, but was felt the shift of a person arriving at a destination after a journey long enough that arriving had sometimes felt theoretical. Tessa spoke for 11 minutes. She spoke in the same voice she had used all day. Clear, ordered, without hesitation. She gave Patricia Ellsworth everything. The account numbers, the corporate vehicle, the chain of beneficial ownership, the mission designation from October 1993, the names of the 3 surviving operators and how to reach them, the name and access protocol for the document archive Frank Kane had built over 14 years, the Senate contact who could receive the record through protected whistleblower channels before any DSA-affiliated party could apply for suppression. She gave all of it. When she stopped speaking, there was a silence on the line that lasted 4 seconds. Patricia Ellsworth said, I have it, all of it. She said it the way a person says a thing when they have been waiting a very long time to be able to say it. The file is being transmitted to the oversight channel now, Ellsworth continued. Authentication is being applied. Once received and logged, it cannot be suppressed or reclassified without a full committee vote requiring notice and a quorum they cannot assemble in less than 72 hours. A pause. You have done it, Tessa. Tessa set the handset down. She stood with her back to the room for a moment. When she turned, her face was doing what it usually did, nothing dramatic. But the quality of the stillness was different from the controlled stillness of the past several hours. It was the stillness that follows the release of sustained effort, the way the air feels after a storm has finally moved through. It is done, she said, and then Ghost came back in, and his face said that the 8 minutes were up. The 3 men who came into the building were dressed in civilian clothing designed to communicate professional authority without specific affiliation. 2 of them moved like contractors, not military, not federal law enforcement, but the particular hybrid that private security produced when it recruited from the military and oriented toward different objectives. The way they entered the room, confirming rather than gathering information about the space, told Stroud everything about what kind of people they were and what kind of instruction they carried. The 3rd man was Alan Vickers. He was 66 years old and looked like 66 years of being very good at something not discussed in ordinary settings. Trim, silver-haired, possessed of the unhurried ease that certain people developed when they had spent decades operating in environments where urgency was a vulnerability and composure was the primary instrument of control. He wore his authority the way a well-tailored jacket is worn without thought, simply present and fitted precisely to the form beneath it. He looked around the room. He looked at Stroud. He looked at Harmon. He looked at Tessa Kane. His expression did not change. That was a piece of information. A man who walked into a room and found the person he was looking for sitting unrestrained and calm should have registered something. Relief if his stated purpose was her welfare. Calculation if it was not. What Vickers registered was nothing. And nothing in a man of his experience was not the absence of reaction, but the management of it and the management itself was the tell. Commander Stroud, Vickers said. His voice was what his appearance suggested, measured, precise, calibrated to project reasonableness while delivering something else. Thank you for your prompt response to the notification. I am Director Vickers DI, a senior advisory division. I believe you spoke with my office. I received a notification, Stroud said. Yes. Good. Vickers looked at Tessa. And this is Ms. Kane. Not a question. I am glad you are safe. You have had quite an ordeal. Tessa looked at Alan Vickers. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything since she was pulled from the water, with the quality of attention that saw through surface presentation to the structural facts beneath. What she saw in Vickers was something she had been preparing to see for 3 years and was now seeing in person for the first time. It was exactly what she had built it to be in her mind, and somehow also worse because the imagination did not include the specific detail of how ordinary he looked. How thoroughly the capacity for what he had done was contained in a form that looked like any other 66-year-old man in a well-cut suit. Mr. Vickers, she said. The room held its breath. Ms. Kane, he said with a warmth that was precisely calibrated. I think there may be some confusion about why I am here. The DIA's interest in your situation is entirely procedural. Given your file designations and the circumstances of your recovery, there are protocols. October 3rd, 1993, she said. Vickers stopped. It was brief, half a second, perhaps less. The pause that only happened when a phrase arrived that was not expected, that cut through the prepared language and reached something underneath it. He recovered immediately. I am sorry, he said. Operation Designation Cardinal, she said. Horn of Africa, a parallel mission unit, 11 operators coordinates provided through your intelligence directive. Her voice had not changed in register or pace. She was delivering verified facts in the manner of someone reading from a record that could not be altered by the reaction of the person hearing it. The coordinates were shared with the opposing side before the unit arrived at their position. 8 operators died in the first 7 minutes. The room was perfectly still. One of the 2 contractors shifted his weight. Vickers looked at Tessa for a long moment. He looked at Harmon. He looked at Stroud. He looked back at Tessa. And something in his expression changed in a way that was subtle and complete. The management of it did not falter. The composure did not break. But a quality went out of it, some layer of performance, and what was beneath it was not the monster she had perhaps expected, because there was no drama in it, no acknowledgement of the weight of what had been done. What was beneath it was assessment, pure, cold operational assessment. A man determining how a situation had developed relative to his expectations and identifying the optimal response. You have a great deal of information, he said. Yes, she said, and I imagine you believe that information constitutes account number 7741, she said, Cayman National Bank. Corporate vehicle Meridian Holdings registered Delaware beneficial owner Alan David Vickers. She continued without pause. Secondary account Liechtenstein Global Trust routing through 3 intermediate institutional layers to the same beneficial owner. She paused for exactly 1 beat. The deposits began in October of 1993 and continued on a quarterly basis for 11 years. Silence. You signed the financial instrument, she said, the original authorization. It exists in the document archive that my father compiled over 14 years and that was transmitted to the Senate Armed Services Committee Oversight Channel 18 minutes ago. Vickers was looking at her, and his expression had arrived somewhere that was not quite stillness. It was the expression of a man who had made a precise calculation and arrived at a result he had not wanted. He said nothing. My father, she said, and her voice was the same, but the air in the room changed when she said it, found the document archive in 2012. He found it and understood what it was, and he began to build the case that would place it in front of an oversight authority you did not control. A pause. And you found out that he had found it. Vickers still said nothing. The order you signed in September of 2012, she said. The elimination order, his name on it. She held his gaze with complete steadiness. That is also in the archive. Harmon across the room made a sound that was barely audible, a sound that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with a confirmation arriving after a long time of knowing without proof. Stroud was looking at Vickers with the stillness of a man who is not going to act precipitously and is also not going to look away. My father did not die in 2012, Tessa said. You signed an order and he chose to disappear rather than wait for it to be executed. He chose 14 years of disappearing over whatever you had planned for him. She paused. And while he was gone, I was here, building what he started. Vickers looked at her for a long moment. Then in the tone of a man who had been in rooms like this before and had always found his way out of them, he said, Tessa, you are a young woman who has been under extreme stress and who has been given, I believe in good faith, a significant amount of material from a source whose reliability I would encourage you to examine more carefully. What you believe is in an archive is already in the possession of the Senate Oversight Channel, she said, as of 18 minutes ago, through a protected whistleblower transmission that cannot be suppressed or reclassified without a full committee vote requiring 72 hours notice. She said it the way she said everything else, without heat, without triumph, the way a person states the conclusion of a completed calculation. The two contractors looked at each other. Vickers was very still. Stroud stepped forward. He stopped in front of Vickers at a distance that was professional and not close, and conveyed without ambiguity that this was now a different kind of conversation. Mr. Vickers, he said, I would like you and your people to wait in the outer room while I confirm the transmission receipt with my operations team. It was not a request. Vickers looked at Stroud. Of course, he said, still smooth, still composed. The composure of a man who had not lost the habit of control even in the moment of losing what he was trying to control. He and the two contractors moved toward the outer room. At the door, he paused and looked back at Tessa one final time. She was looking at him. There was nothing in her expression that could be called satisfaction, nothing that could be called anger or grief or relief or any of the large performed emotions that moments like this produced in lesser iterations of itself. There was simply her looking at him with the same clear and complete attention she brought to everything, and in that clarity was something more complete and more final than any of those other things could have been, because it contained all of them and had chosen not to display any of them. He left the room. The door closed. Stroud was already on the radio. The confirmation came back in 6 minutes. Patricia Ellsworth's transmission had been received, logged, and authenticated by the Oversight Channel at 1641 hours. The file was in protected custody. Formal notification had been sent to the Senate Armed Services Committee chairperson and 2 ranking members. A legal protection order covering all associated witnesses and sources was being prepared for immediate filing. The Senate notification had as a secondary function triggered an automatic hold on all DIA personnel travel and communications pending review, a provision existing specifically for situations in which DIA personnel were implicated in the subject matter of an oversight inquiry. Alan Vickers would not be leaving today, not the way he had planned. Stroud relayed this to the outer room through Ghost, who had positioned himself there in a way that was technically unofficial and practically authoritative. He came back in. He stood in the center of the room and looked at Tessa Kane, and for a long moment he said nothing, because what had happened was large enough that words needed time to find their correct size relative to it. Then he said, "It is done." She nodded once, a very small nod for a very large thing. Marsh had not said a word for 40 minutes. He had sat against the wall through the confrontation with Vickers, and through the confirmation and through the procedural activity that followed, sitting with his arms resting on his knees and his eyes taking in everything with the concentrated attention of someone who understood they were in the presence of something that mattered, something that would matter long after this day was over, and who had decided that witnessing it properly was the contribution he could make. When the room had settled, when Stroud had stepped out to deal with the outer hallway situation, and Harmon had moved to a corner to make calls on his personal phone, Marsh stood up from the wall and crossed the room and stopped in front of Tessa. She looked at him. "This morning," he said, "the heat stroke." "Yes," she said. "You had been in the water for 72 hours and you looked at me and you saw what was wrong." "Yes," she said. "And this afternoon," he said, 820 meters. "Yeah," she nodded. "And the seawall tonight," he said, 1,160 meters, with a fragment in your shoulder." She held his gaze. "And all of this," he said, gesturing at the room, at the space where Vickers had stood at the weight of everything the day had carried. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing he had been holding since 0400 hours that morning. "I am going to tell this story for the rest of my life," he said. "Not the classified parts, the parts that can be told, the parts about what you did and who you are." He paused. "I want you to know that." Tessa Kane looked at Derek Marsh, and then she said, "Rest 12 hours before full duty. I mean it this time." He almost laughed. He nodded instead with a warmth in it that said everything the laugh would have said. He went to find somewhere to sit. Briggs came to her next. He came without ceremony and without building toward it. He simply walked to where she was standing and stopped and looked at her with an expression that had traveled an enormous distance since this morning and had arrived somewhere honest and direct and undecorated. "I was wrong twice today," he said. She waited. "On the deck this morning, I looked at you and saw what I expected to see," he said. "I did not look past it." She said nothing. "In the vehicle on the way to the range, I sat across from you and I watched you prepare, and I knew before we got there that I had been wrong on the deck. I knew it and I did not say so." He paused. "I should have said so before the shot, not after." "Why does the timing matter?" she asked. "Because saying it before means something different than saying it after," he said. "After is easy. Anyone can be right after the fact." He held her gaze. "I am sorry I did not say it before." She looked at Colt Briggs for a moment with the full weight of her attention. Then she said, "You pulled me out of the water at 03 as 12 this morning. You got your hands under that piece of hull plating in the dark Pacific, and you got me up. Everything after that was possible because of that." He had not thought of it that way. She could see that. "You were doing your job," she said. "Everything else followed from that." He stood with this. Then he nodded once slowly with the manner of a man accepting something and intending to carry it properly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He stepped back. Stroud came back into the room 20 minutes later with the look of a man who had handled several difficult consecutive conversations. He stood in front of Tessa. "The Senate hold is in effect," he said. "Vickers and his people are being detained pending formal oversight notice. The contractors will be handed to federal law enforcement. Vickers will be handled through the DIA Inspector General's office under the committee's authority." He paused. "Patricia Ellsworth is preparing the formal protective designation for you and for the 3 surviving operators from 1993. That documentation will be in place by morning." She nodded. "And your father," he said. She looked at him. "The protective designation will include him," Stroud said carefully, "as a material witness and as a surviving officer whose official records require formal correction." He paused. "The process of restoring his status will take time, but the legal protection is immediate." Another pause. "He can surface," she said. "Not tonight," Stroud said, "but soon, through the right channels with the right protections in place." He held her gaze. "Soon." She was very still for a moment. In that stillness, Stroud saw something he had not seen in the entire day of watching her, a day of watching someone carry a weight with extraordinary skill and extraordinary endurance. He saw the moment very briefly when the person carrying the weight understood that the ground beneath them was solid and other hands were available and had been there in some form all along. It lasted less than 3 seconds. She was composed again, almost immediately. But he had seen it. "Corman Kane," he said. She looked at him. "In 4 years of command," he said, "I have encountered a great many people with a great many different capabilities. I have had the experience more times than I can count of watching someone do something I was not fully prepared for." He paused. "Today," he said, "was the most considerable version of that experience I have had." He said it without decoration, without performance. A commander telling a person the truth of what he had witnessed. She received it the way she received everything, without display, without deflection, with simple and honest acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir," she said. He nodded. He stepped back. Wade was the last. He had been present all day and had said only what needed to be said, providing the kind of presence that did not require volume, but that you felt throughout the day as a steady weight on the side of things that were right. He came to stand beside her now, and they both looked at the same space for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "He will call. When the protection is formal and the channels are clear, he will call." She turned her head slightly toward him. "I know," she said. "He has been waiting," Wade said, "the way he has been doing everything for 14 years patiently, completely." A pause, "But he has been waiting." She was quiet for a moment. "I have too," she said. They stood in the silence for a while, and it was the right kind of silence for the end of a very long day. 6 months later, Naval Medical Center, San Diego, March 2027. The classroom held 22 people comfortably, which meant the 18 currently seated in it had room to breathe, and not so much room that they felt separate from each other. The chairs were arranged in a modified arc rather than rows, a choice the instructor had made when setting up the room, because rows were appropriate for conveying information and arcs were appropriate for building the kind of understanding that needed to move laterally between students as well as from front to back. The instructor was 28 years old. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she was carrying weight she had put back on over the course of 6 months of eating properly and sleeping adequately and not being in the water. She looked entirely healthy, which she was. The shadows under her eyes had been gone for months. The rope of scar tissue on her left shoulder, where the fragment had caught her during the seawall operation, was fading toward white in the way of scars on young skin that had been given time to heal. She stood at the front of the room with both hands resting on the lectern and looked at the 18 faces looking back at her. Navy corpsmen, Army combat medics, 2 Air Force pararescuemen, all young, all trained in their primary roles, all here because they had been selected for a program that had been running for 4 months and was currently under review by the Veterans Administration for development into a formal curriculum for implementation in 5 states. The program was called Integrated Combat Medicine. Its founding principle was stated on the board behind the instructor's head in plain block letters, "Drag them out alive." Tessa had not put that phrase there. It had been placed there by the second cohort of students, the first group to complete the full curriculum, and she had walked in one morning to find it written in someone's handwriting and had looked at it for a long moment and then decided to leave it. It was more accurate than anything she would have chosen. She looked at the 18 faces. She thought about where she had been 6 months ago. Not with nostalgia, not with the backward-looking sentiment that softened hard things into manageable shapes, but with the clear recognition of someone who understood that where you had been and what it had cost were not separate from who you were now, and that who you were now was built from all of it, the easy parts and the hard ones equally. She began. "What you are going to learn in this program," she said, "is not a set of skills. Skills are the straightforward part. The harder part is what you learn after the skills, the judgment about when to use which one, and how to move between them in the space of 3 seconds when the situation changes faster than your training anticipated." She paused. "You are going to be in situations where you have someone in front of you bleeding out and there is a threat behind you that will kill you both if you do not address it, and you have 3 seconds to decide." Another pause. "This program exists because someone decided a long time ago that the answer to that situation was not to choose, that the answer was to be capable of both things without hesitation." She looked at them. "The most important thing I can give you is not how to apply a tourniquet or how to hold a rifle. The most important thing is this: the moment you decide you are only one thing, you have already limited what you can give the person who needs you most." She let it sit. "Both hands," she said. "That is the concept, both hands. You will hear it from me every day until you stop thinking about it, because it has become what you are rather than what you are trying to be." A young corpsman in the front row named Calloway raised his hand. He had arrived with the focused earnestness of someone who understood they were here to learn something that mattered. "Yes," she said. "Ma'am," Calloway said, has there been a time when you had to do both at the same time?" Awing. Tessa looked at him. Behind him, 17 other faces waited for the answer. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. He waited for more. She did not give more. "Open your manuals to chapter 3, she said. "We are going to start with hemorrhage control under stress, and we are going to practice it in conditions that do not allow you to stop and think." They opened their manuals. She moved from the lectern. She did not tell them the story because the story was not hers to tell in a classroom. The story belonged to the men who had died in October of 1993 and had never been formally acknowledged. It belonged to the 3 who had survived and had finally given their testimony 6 weeks ago, sitting before an oversight panel and saying the names of their 8 teammates without performance, without drama, with the flat and honest dignity of people who had been carrying a weight for 33 years and had finally been given a place to set it down. The story belonged to Frank Kane, who had surfaced 3 weeks after the formal protection order came through in a call that lasted 47 minutes, during which Tessa had said almost nothing and had not needed to, because the voice on the other end was doing what it needed to do, and she was doing what she needed to do, which was listen. He had called twice more since then. On the 3rd call, he had asked about the program. She described it. He listened. When she finished, he said, "That is the work." 3 words. The kind of 3 words her father used when he meant something that could have been said 20 other ways. But he was precise, and so he said it in the minimum number of syllables that carried the full weight. The work. Not the mission, not the operation. The work, the thing that continued after the dramatic event, resolved the thing that compounded over time. The thing that was not about any single moment, but about what was built from all the moments taken together. She moved between the students, watching their hands on the practice material, correcting grip and positioning with the same direct economy she brought to everything. Calloway was going to be very good. He had hands that did not know they were steady because they had never been anything else. A young medic named Brennan in the third row was gripping too hard, which was the most common error among people who were thinking about what they were doing rather than simply doing it. She stopped behind him and said, "Hands," quietly, and he adjusted immediately and then adjusted again when she did not move, and he understood she meant further. She moved through the room. Through the window at the end of the classroom, she could see the edge of the base and beyond it the Pacific, which was flat and silver this morning, and looked entirely different from how it looked at 0312 hours from 4 feet above its surface when you were reading stars through 40% cloud cover and calculating drift. She looked at it for a moment, then she turned back to the room. On her desk beneath her notes was an envelope. She had placed it there before the students arrived. Inside was a piece of paper folded twice in a handwriting she had not seen in person for 14 years, but knew better than almost any other in the world because it had been present in her life in various forms since she was old enough to read. The envelope had arrived at her apartment 6 days ago, postmarked from a city in Northern Europe. No return address. The message was 9 words. She had read it twice and folded it and put it in her desk, then taken it out this morning and put it in her bag because there were days when you wanted a thing near you. The message said, "Well done, Tessa. The work continues. I'm proud of you." Below that, a single initial. She thought about her father in a room somewhere in Northern Europe, watching the news cycle, watching the proceedings of the Senate Oversight Committee, watching a case that had taken 14 years to arrive, at the point where arriving was possible, now moving through the proper channels with the slow institutional weight of something that would not be stopped. She thought about 8 men who had died in a place that had no official name and would now be given one. She thought about 3 men who had carried what they witnessed for 33 years and had finally been given the place to put it down. She thought about a piece of hull plating and a starfield through 40% cloud cover and the precise weight of a Barrett M82A1 and the quality of a crosswind at 820 meters and then at 1,160 with a fragment of concrete already in her left shoulder. She thought about both hands, about the hands that applied a tourniquet and the hands that held a rifle, and about the 14 years between putting one down and picking the other back up, and about the fact that neither had ever stopped being hers, and that the only thing that had changed was whether she had been willing to use them together, whether the time was right, whether she was ready. "Calloway," she said. He looked up. "Show me the femoral compression point," she said. He showed her. She corrected his left hand placement by half an inch. "Again," she said. He did it again. "Again," she said. 30 seconds. No thinking. "Your hands know. Let them." He did it again, and again, and again. Around him, the other 17 students were doing the same, the room filling with the sound of people learning to do difficult things in difficult conditions, until the difficulty was no longer the point and only the doing remained. Tessa Kane stood in the center of the room and watched them learn and said what needed to be said, when it needed to be said, and nothing more. The window was open at the far end of the classroom. The Pacific moved beyond it, gray and silver and indifferent, the way it had always been and would always be. She turned her back to it and faced the room. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. That was the part her father had known from the beginning, long before she had been willing to know it herself. Not that the hands were capable of extraordinary things, though they were, but that the steadiness in them had always been there, waiting the way certain kinds of strength wait, not diminishing with time, but deepening, not weakening under the weight of years, but growing more precise, more deliberate, more entirely itself. He had not given her the steadiness. He had recognized it. He had taught her to trust it. And now she was here in a room full of people who were learning the same thing she had spent 14 years learning, that the most important decision was not which hand to use, but the understanding that both hands belonged to the same person, and that person was whole, and that wholeness was not a compromise between two things, but the fullest possible expression of one. Both hands. Drag them out alive. The work continues. Outside, the Pacific moved in the light of a San Diego morning, and Tessa Kane taught the next generation how to carry what they had been given without putting any part of it down.